our last talk. We've been organizing around 12 talks, one each evening. Everything, all of them like connecting to the publication that we are doing at the moment, we are working on at the moment. And tonight we invited Laurent Stalder in the frame of the publication about representation that we are doing with him. And so Laurent Stalder is architect, teacher, and researcher, professor of history at ETH since 2006. And Thomas Weaver, a writer, teacher, editor, critic, and editor at the MIT Press. And also has been editor at AA Files and other, a lot of other publications. And we will talk tonight about architecture and editing. The talk is gonna be open to questions. And so don't be shy. We can interrupt them whenever we want. Actually, they ask that. So voila, this is the frame. So I give you the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you for inviting us. I'm very happy to have the possibility to engage with Tom. I was thinking back before this talk, and the first project we did together was exactly 10 years ago on François d'Allegret, actually a French, so it's a good way to speak about. And since then, we have been working together me as an author in AA Files, and lastly in a publication we are preparing for MIT Press. And this talk was also for us the possibility, I think, to ask questions that we never asked each other while working. Actually, we had a very, I think, a very productive way of engaging. I think sometimes you find in the world a person who has the same beliefs, and through working together, somehow you develop project without asking somehow the most basic questions. So I'm very happy, Tom, to have this kind of intimate moment with you in this public sphere now. And Claudia introduced you well as an educator, as a researcher, as a teacher, as a critic, and as a trained architect. So the most obvious question that I never asked to you is somehow, how did you come to books, and perhaps what is the relation of books to architecture for you as a trained architect?
Very good question. And also, just as a sort of preamble, I agree that we've been working together for a long time now, and we've asked ourselves lots of questions, but sometimes we've forgotten the obvious ones. So in a way, the things we're going to talk about now are the obvious. It's not as if these are deep and meaningful questions, but they're obvious. But maybe there's depth and meaning in how obvious they are. But yeah, getting into books, I mean, where to begin? I could begin biographically in terms of my kind of family, in the sense that books have always been the architecture of my family, or walls of books have been ways we've always presented ourselves, or the spaces I've lived in or was brought up in. But in terms of more professionally or academically, or in terms of architecture, my sort of career path, or the way I started to take a responsibility in terms of making and producing books, really developed when I was doing my doctorate in the US at Princeton. And it, in a sense, emerged out of a common dilemma, is that I was stuck. I was incapable of writing my own PhD for reasons I realized later, that I was in the US at a moment which was full of, where architecture was presented as a theory, and I was interested in things, more interested in things than I was in theories, and I felt more than a little paralyzed in terms of communicating those ideas and those ambitions through theories, much rather through things. But whatever, I was stuck. But I still wanted to kind of communicate with my supervisor, who I was very fond of and had a very nice communicative relationship with. And so I transferred, in a sense, my eagerness to work by, instead of talking to him about my writing, I started to talk to him about his writing. And this was Georges Teyssot, who was a great French architectural historian, but one who was found himself in many ways in Italy. So he communicated to others and with himself largely in French and Italian, which was wonderful in terms of his intellectual capacities, but was a disaster in terms of his English language. So his work was wonderfully layered, multi-layered, but to my English ear, instantly I could see ways of helping him and fixing some of the sentences. So it began at Princeton for me, really, working with Georges Teyssot on much of his writing, and actually writing that became eventually a book, a book on the sort of topology of everyday life, a book about domesticity and architecture, in a sense. But yeah, that's where it started. But since that moment, I sort of quickly then increasingly started to edit other people's writings and to work with other academics. But again, always from that idea that I was in the academy with them. I've always resented the idea that I'm a technician, that I'm fixing something like a plumber or an electrician. I liked the idea that I was talking to them about ideas as well as the more technical capacity of writing.
And one aspect, actually, you have been speaking only about the writing, but somehow one aspect which seems crucial is a deep love you have for the object. Also, you have been speaking about being interested in things, and somehow it's very disturbing, and somehow the image has a key role. It's not about just editing text, but it's also very much about supporting an argument through visual means, isn't it?
Yeah, again, absolutely. And this was one of the problems I was having at the time in that sort of mid-1990s, where intelligent discourse or architectural discourse was always presented through words and not or images. Okay, we're getting a little bit of audio overlap, Claudia.
Sorry, we have an issue because we hear Laurent very, very loud, and we hear you not loud enough. So we have to work a little bit with the volume every time that the sorry, a little bit of technical. Is it okay now, Ava? Okay, let's try.
Shall I speak louder? Louder.
This is good. Sorry. It's okay. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. Yeah, so it was just that moment about objects. But yeah, you're right, Laurent, that for me, this is why I like architecture, because I see architecture in lots of objects, not just the obvious object of the building, but also the object of the drawing, and of the architect themselves, but as carried by the object that is the book. And all of my editorial life has been moving between these objects through, in a sense, through the vehicle that is the sentence or through the publication. And so that is the architecture. It's a wider architecture of things, rather than the older model or a sort of a cliched model where one thinks of an idea, one writes that idea, and then one transfers that idea into a book.
Could you imagine even that one could consider the book himself as a form of design, or perhaps the knowledge acquisition that you were not able somehow to write in the dissertation? Could the book be a form of epistemic object? At the end?
Absolutely, and not necessarily one that comes afterwards. it can come before. Again, in English terms, you talk about a horse and a cart. You know, one pulls the other, but actually with architecture, with books, with buildings, with drawings, I think each of them can sometimes be the horse, and each of them can sometimes be the cart. So yeah, and that's where later, you know, I'm reassured by the fact that I'm not the first person to think about this. In a sense, I'm the last person to think about this, not least because the very first architect, Vitruvius, did exactly that. He wrote his architecture in the form of a book. So the book is the architecture. So I like to sort of ennoble this as part of a classical tradition. It goes back to the beginning.
Yet, and I think another passage I didn't completely understand either is that going to AA files at a certain moment, somehow through works with any, you arrive at the AA in a very established framework, but a very British framework again, and perhaps for the first time you are not just responsible for fixing something or dialoguing with a specific person, but suddenly you went from one person to 4,000 persons you had to speak to. Can you? I loved very much AA files, but I never completely understood how you build it up.
Yeah, I love it very much too, and now that I'm not doing it, it feels like a leg that is missing. You know, I'm like a man who's lost his leg. I keep reaching for a space that isn't there. So the ghost of AA files haunts me the whole time. And in a way, I didn't realize how useful it was, not just as a physical thing, but as a rhetorical thing. So the AA is a weird kind of institution. It's a school of architecture. It's the oldest school of architecture, independent school of architecture in England, you know, nearly 200 years, you know, from the mid-19th century. But it was interesting because it was first of all a club and a magazine, and then later a school. So at its core was an idea of disseminating ideas in the form of published works. And throughout that period, those 170, 200 years, it had always produced magazines, lots of different versions of things. And I was hired to be the latest, or the then latest editor of those magazines. And given a very open brief, I could just do whatever I liked as long as I produced a magazine. I had to produce a thing. So yeah, there was a sort of historical and cultural responsibility, but also in some sense, there was a kind of a lack of ambition that by the time I took it over, the AA was much more interested in drawings and projects, and had slightly forgotten the book and the magazine. And it had also become a hugely international school. And so again, where the architecture project conveys that internationalism very easily, whereas books and magazines have always had difficulty with these things because you have to get the writing right. It takes a long time. But over a number of years, I sort of developed AA files and made it, speaking more narcissistically, I like to think I made it more than a magazine. In a sense, it was a demonstration of a relationship to architecture, as well as pedagogy and teaching, but just an appreciation of architecture in lots of different forms, as images, as sentences, as English things, but as also as international things, as famous things, but as also as very obscure things.
And was it clear for you which position you would take? Because somehow from a historical perspective, from where we are looking now, it seems that the magazine is very linked to what we call a material turn in history and theory of architecture, but perhaps also in architectural practice, where somehow the making, the physicality of the object is crucial, but also the way we discuss architecture, that indeed the long theoretical path with, on the one way, a very powerful operative request toward theory, on the other side, very much a history of theory, was like going down, and where from everywhere it seems to me a kind of necessity to ground somehow the discipline back to its core questions.
Yeah, I think at the time I was unaware of that zeitgeist, or in a sense, those shifting currents of what the discipline was happening, a sort of a post-critical moment or a return to a material moment. I just felt adamant at the time. I wanted to be iconoclastic. I wanted to be irreverent with the AA itself. And the AA was just producing projects and no words. So I said, okay, I don't want any projects in my magazine. I only want words. So I wanted to do the opposite. So in a sense, one of my regrets then is that I created a separation between architecture as practice, whether that's at the level of a student or as a practitioner, and architectural discourse, which was history and theory. And I was firmly in history and theory. But as the magazine developed, and as I developed my own relationship to it and architecture, I tried to collapse those boundaries. I've never liked architecture through a sort of tribalism, through affinities or allegiances to different movements or styles or people. I've always liked architecture in the most holistic sense, because I feel it's most appealing in its ability to handle everything and anything.
And what is also, sorry.
I just had a question listening to that. So what is, according to your experience, Tom, the difference of your role in inside a magazine, let's say, and in a book production, like what is the different perspective you have?
Yeah, it's a good question. The fundamental difference is when you're a guardian over a magazine, you're putting different things into the same object. And when you're a guardian of a book, you're putting the same things into unique, different objects.
Yeah.
But each time you have to produce something different with the book, or the book is its own object, its own vessel.
And do you live that like completely, do you think it's two completely different experiences? Because I asked this question because here in Caryatide, we do both. We try to do a magazine and we try to do books. I mean, for me, it's very interesting to see, to understand from you what you think about that. Is that completely two different things yeah. And experience?
Yeah, I think so. I think completely and utterly different. And I must admit, now that I'm returning to my leg that is missing, I miss the magazine. I really miss it because it's so much more efficient. It's so much easier.
It's easier
to handle difference and push difference through into one object. But also because people are so much more interesting when they're writing shorter
yes.
things.
Yeah,
much more boring when they're writing longer things. Or they have to be very sure of themselves and helped in terms of writing a longer form thing.
Maybe the book is also overwhelming sometimes. In my experience, sometimes the architects with whom we work, if they know that they are publishing a book, they are not overwhelmed, but they criticize themselves a lot. So before handing in the last documents to put in the books, they're really trying that it's the right thing, no? While maybe if it's an article, it's easier to, I don't know,
No, it's right, it's true. But it's also, a book is their thing. You know,
exactly, yeah.
It is a mirror of themselves. And a magazine is something that they're just pretending. It's a costume, very briefly, that they're part of. Mm-hmm. And I think that transience produces more interesting ideas, better ideas.
But we have a question, another question.
Now, following this conversation between magazine and book, I have the feeling that maybe.
Yes, maybe.
I have the feeling that in a magazine, it's a bit like in a group show, group exhibition, whereas in a book, as an architect, it's a bit like if the architect is doing a solo show. So it triggers different things.
And the responsibility maybe that you feel it's less.
And maybe for the editor, the role is different because you have to deal with different personalities in the magazine and just with one personality in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so. But I think there's also there's lots of things going on here. There's also about brevity. You know, magazines are shorter and books are longer. But it's slightly like the editor with a magazine is slightly like a film director, that some film directors, when they have a cast of characters, they only give the script, the words that each character reads. They don't give them the whole story. They deliberately keep the whole story away from them, whereas other directors like to present the whole. So with A-files and other things I've edited, I quite like chance encounters. I don't like to say, I am going to do an issue on the politics of form, and then everybody writes about the politics of form. I like just to get articles together that are almost arbitrary, and then I like the almost randomness of them coming together. And then patterns emerge almost in an accidental way.
Okay, so you're not trying to find like fil rouge, like a red line
thread.
connect.
No.
Okay, interesting.
I hate themes. I hate thematization.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And academia loves themes.
Yes.
Whereas I like architecture because it's just architecture, you know, and it already has its own ability to talk about everything. Why should you thematize everything?
So then how do you build up a number? How do you do?
It's like fishing. I keep mixing my metaphors here. You throw your bait into the river or the sea, and you catch a fish, and then you catch another fish, and when you have 10, you go home and you cook them.
Yes, but then you for example, do you go directly to somebody and you ask, write me something about I don't know, or write me something you have in mind now, or how?
Yeah, mostly me personally, I like to edit by going after the writer or the subject.
Okay.
I don't like to edit by waiting for things to come to me.
Come to you, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But of course, all options are available.
Okay. Okay.
And that was actually why it was nice to meet and collaborate with Laurent. You know, we discover nice shared interests, and projects emerge out of conversation. The project emerges collectively, and we think about what it might be. Mm-hmm. And that's where the end result, the journal or the article or the book, is a rather useful thing. We have to do it in some form. So how are we going to do that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
But Laurent, did you started writing journal articles before books, didn't you?
Yes, absolutely. I felt into history somehow. It was not a conscious choice. It was after my architectural studies, indeed, I began to write, and I began as an architectural critic somehow. So this was very much the case of my generation, that you would teach, but also write about contemporary architecture. And besides this, as you know, I developed my PhD, and I discovered there also that I was more an essay person, that somehow that I was able to keep an argument around 10 to 15 pages. I don't know if it's a weakness or a strength. I always had the impression it's a weakness not to be able, especially as a historian, to argue an argument for more than, let's say, 10 minutes.
But that's where, luckily, I think things are changing. I think it was a weakness weakness, you know, between 1950 and 2000, but increasingly I think it's a strength. People who can write shorter, sharper.
Yeah, but the difficulty is still, I think, it's very ambivalent, I would say, because on the one side, being able to write 10 to 15 pages reflects very much how academia works today. So somehow that you need to publish a series of essays of 10 to 15 pages somehow to get a position somewhere. Let's say this is a very cynic way of doing it, but I think, as you also pointed out yourself, somehow the natural sciences, by the way, who were also writing books in the 19th century and not just essay. So the natural sciences, the way the natural sciences work, very much shaped the way we today are assessed. And I think we cannot avoid looking at this. This is a condition of today's academia.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. On the one side, one can of course be an essay person, but still, I think one of the difficulty, and that's the whole discussion we are having now, is how do you bring it to a coherent whole, or how can you, even if you don't have a linear argument, how can it still be a substantial contribution to the field? And this is for me the very much the difficulty. And I think by working in dialogue, indeed, you are forced to clarify the ideas you bring up. And as we, I think, both agree, the image is there a very important thing. And perhaps, and that's where I think AA File gave a good example, is somehow that what is at stake is more to depict the field than to prove a hypothesis. And this is perhaps a construction I also did for me, but I think this is one which works extremely well for me, and maybe it's also a product of the time.
Yeah, again, I think that was something I realized later, but I'm naturally drawn to writing and thinking that begins by describing something. You're simply presenting something and you describe it. So you're hiding behind the banality of description. But actually, I think description is can be very lyrical and rather poetic. Whereas my academic training, certainly in America, is that you begin with interpretation. You begin by analyzing something. And then later, after you interpret, you then apply that to some poor object. Example A, example B, example C. And then you end again with interpretation. Whereas again, I like working the other way around. You describe, and then slowly you start to make associative ideas. So I think that that's, for me, what is endemic to the essay model rather than the academic paper or the longer book form. But I also think it's something that's very natural to architecture.
Yes, but what we're describing, I think, is also very much a difference of cultures between American architectural culture and European architectural culture. I think without judging which is better or worse, I think there are some specificities. For instance, that the American academic has no relation in any way to architectural practice. And even the practitioners who are teaching at the university, for the less part, somehow are really engaged into an important architectural practice. And I think this is the way American deal with the question, by somehow in a very 19th century Marxian understanding of dividing somehow the work in different specialities. I don't know if it's a personal path or it has to do with ETH or with the Central European architectural practice. I I could explain it somehow through my training first as an archaeologist, where what you are saying, the question of description is really key. Somehow an archaeologist cannot begin with the theory, and he cannot assume that everybody knows what he's speaking about, but he has really to properly assess the different layers he's excavating. He has to explain why one brick is over the other. And when he has done this, then he might be able somehow to draw a more general understanding of society behind it. And similarly, the way, at least how I was taught architecture, it was a very practical way. I was always trained by practitioners, and the belief that architecture was not just a service, but it was itself an intellectual activity, and that this intellectual activity is expressed in any building, was very, very at the center of my education. And I think that's still the way I understand it, and that's the way also I analyze architecture when I speak about, let's say, for the book for you on Hanston by Alison and Peter Smithson. Somehow you can understand so much of the question they were asking themselves by describing the system of beams and pillars, screws, how the toilet is arranged, how the staircase are arranged. It's not one staircase with a corridor, but it's a series of staircases. So all the question which seems for Mies van der Rohe or Le Corbusier definitely set it, is somehow slightly changed and gives to the building a completely other meaning and a completely other expression that is post-war and cannot be pre-war idealistic German architecture. And I think, yes, I think that's where we meet somehow very much in this belief. Yet the description is a very tricky thing, like all academic writing, you know, the academics, and I see it also with our PhD program, you know, you teach them do first this and this and this, and you have to speak about this and this author. So there is always an ambivalence between teaching the basics and when the basics become the rules. And the same is, I think, for description. There is also a lot of hollow description, which is nice to read, but which is very weak too.
Yeah, but I think we shouldn't ever underestimate nice to read. I mean, I like writing like stories. You know, when someone tells me a nice sentence, I want to hear the next one. And if that sentence is not so interesting, then that's what defines a bad piece of writing to me, when I don't want to know more. I don't want to keep reading, just like a book or a storybook.
Yeah, but Tom, if I may interrupt you, you know, you are speaking to me like you would speak to an editor of as we are in France, of Proust. And now most of your authors are quite poor writers, right? In comparison to writers.
Yes, but I think I'd much rather work that way round. That is, introduce a bit of lyricism or poetry to someone who has lots of ideas but an inability to convey them. Just as I would much rather work with the kind of the cliche of the Swiss system of someone who has no doubt what architecture is, who understands the pragmatism, the material qualities of it, and then I can throw ideas at them, or books or references, or a wider intellectual or cultural context. It's so much easier that way around. Because I've tried working the other way around, which is to a North American audience who know every theory and every philosophy and every idea about everything, but they don't know a nice building. So trying to give them the pragmatism of the building is very, very difficult, or to understand the appreciation of that building is very difficult.
And Claudia said that you were fishing for authors, but how do you do it actually? If I understand well, you just launched a series of 80 books now?
Yeah.
So when I heard this, I was a little bit offended, of course, because I discovered
You're one of 80. You thought you're one of one. Yeah, there's 80 of you, Laurent. You're not unique.
Okay.
It's a good question. I mean, the cliche, the standard way, the conventional way editors find work is they go to a big event, where a big conference or a big annual architectural, in this case, architectural event, and they sit in a booth and they have a name badge on that says their publisher and their name. And then people queue up and they give that person a manuscript. And then you come away with 50 manuscripts, and then you're feeding, in a sense, once. And then you live off the year feeding off that material, and then you process it. Again, like I said, I don't like receiving things. I like going out and finding interesting people and interesting subjects and putting the two together. So I find things just by talking to people, or, I mean, it was so much easier in a world before pandemics when you couldn't go and give a talk. This is where I like the collapse between an editorial world and an academic world, because I like going into schools and giving talks or seminars, not so much for the experience of the talk and the seminar, it's what happens afterwards. When you go to lunch, when you go to dinner, and when you go and have a drink, someone says, oh, I saw this great talk, blah, 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 or I saw this lovely building, or I read this funny story. And then you find stuff, you find references, and then you come home and then you approach these people, or you follow up on these leads. And very, very quickly, one trip can give you 20 things, and then 20 things produce 20 other things. So there's an enormous network of opportunities there. I've never had any difficulty finding content. The difficulty is the time it takes to process that, to produce the actual physical object is very slow. But finding things, there's a million great books out there, a million.
And can you be a little bit more specific about what you call processing? So I understand there is all the administrative work, you know, finding money, having, you know, but there is also this what we began with the discussion with, was this engagement with the author.
This comes back to Claudia's question. I mean, processing is so much easier with a magazine than with a book. So in my former life with a magazine, processing meant receiving a text or talking to an author about a text, and then they develop it. And then there's more conversations as I make suggestions and changes. And then at a certain point, they give the text to me, and then I start, like a mechanic, I start tweaking it, you know, adding a little bit here, taking a bit there, polishing it, making it sound interesting. That process can take a while, and I like to do that myself. I like to get my hands dirty and actually fix the text, edit. That's what I would call editing. And then the same process also involves thinking about images. So it's not simply words, because as you know, this is why we're friends, Laurent. We like images alongside text, that we're pure Diderot, d'Alembert. Text, images are there together. It isn't that the image is subservient to the text. They're the same thing. So I like that process, that editorial process. And that inevitably, after you get a text right, you start to think about how the images work. And then you start to think about graphic design. And then you start to think about colors and fonts and papers and bindings, and the thing happens. With a book, it's a million times harder because the texts are so much longer and each book has to be different.
I have a question. So what is your relationship with the graphic design actually? So because you read the text, you work on the text, you are the one also deciding where to put the images and to know the role of the image next to the text. So what is your relationship with the graphic designers? How do you work with them?
I adore graphic designers. I think they're almost biblical. They're people of goodness, you know, that they are sort of saints almost. Well, I like the way graphic designers think, that they're thinking through the digital of words on a screen or images on a screen, but they also love the smell of ink, and they like plates on a roller, and they like touching things. And so I like their commitment to material things and ethereal things. But I love that moment when you transition with an author and thinking about a work, and even thinking about what it might look like, and then you bring in another character, another actor who has something else to say and can transform that work. So the best projects I've done all have an integrated graphic design voice and are made so much better, and they become a vital collaborator.
But Tom, do you expect them to read your text?
The graphic designer?
Yes.
Nice question.
No. Sometimes some graphic designers, I myself say, this person is a genius graphic designer because they read a book, because they read the text. But actually not all designers need to read. They can understand something by me giving a summary of it or explaining some of the ideas, or they just get it intuitively. So yeah, sure, there's good designers and bad designers, but I think they all work in different ways. But the designers I like understand that a design is an elastic thing. The designers I hate are like artists, and they give you a design and you're expected to applaud. I like the idea that there's a certain flexibility to a design.
Questions here? Because we have some graphic designers in the public, so maybe, no? Later, maybe later. Let's go on.
But Laurent, you know that too. In a sense, the great, in a sense, first really amazing book you presented was a book of design in many ways, where the object, I'm talking about the Olgiati book, even if you forget everything inside of the book, itself is amazing as an object, as a construction, as a piece of architecture.
Yes, this is an ambivalent project, because I was lucky enough, I think, again, to find somebody with Valerio Olgiati who had such a precise understanding of the materiality of a book, that it was easy to follow. So somehow he came with the format, he came with the layout, and me was just bringing in a written argument that supported somehow the design. So the book, as you know it, is a book with a large format where the pages are glued. And the advantage of glued images is that when you open the book, that the image doesn't disappear in the middle of the book. And you know it from children's books. This is a very often used way with children's books. And so what was at stake somehow was to arrange the graphic elements that were given by the office. So we decided in a very classical way to put the drawings first and the image later. So it's very Albertian somehow, that you proceed from an abstract idea and it grows up into a specific design. And similarly, the text also went from the imaginary up to to the question of construction, up to the question of spatial reception. So there is a kind of coherence between the project, the layout, and the text, which follows up. I was much more, I think that the Bow Wow book we did sometimes later was much more a discussion between us and the graphic designer, because I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to bring together the capacity of Atelier Bow Wow of thinking architecture through buildings, through research projects, and through books. And that's why we decided to order it in a chronological way, somehow, in a very primitive chronological way, but which somehow represented very much the movement of their work, and showed also how the shifting and the development of that work. And there it was also very clear for me that in comparison to Valerio Algiati, who is very much an authorial, an authoritative person, that the network that is so important in Atelier Bow Wow should somehow be represented in the book design. So that's why the book is divided in different columns. So we have in the center buildings or text about key ideas, and then we have around it smaller images and smaller texts which are differentiated by the different voices. So the text by Atelier Bow Wow, the text by a historian, the text by a critique. And this gave somehow the layout with the graphic designer. At the end, we had quite a strong fight about his introduction of a picture essay at the end, which I didn't want to have. And I still think the book would be stronger without it. But this was somehow something I was not able to negotiate, but that's how things are. Yes, that's my experience of. But these are almost artistic books where you need, I think, a very strong collaboration. I think, as you said, and that's why you are so positive towards graphic designers. I think it's not about the profession as say, it's about a person who is engaged with what he's doing and who works for the thing and not for himself. And I think this makes very much the difference. And I think this is also what you do in your work, and that's also what I appreciate. Of course, the object is very good, and of course we know it's Tom Weaver behind it, but at the end it's about AA files, and not about you. And
but I must admit, increasingly, I'm, the nature, again, this is the problem with books as opposed to journals, is that the industry or the whole publishing game is trying to save money. And the way it's saving money at the moment is devolving or removing the two things that I love the most, which is editing and graphic design. So increasingly now books are produced that aren't really edited because it's too expensive and it takes too long. And they aren't designed as unique things. They're just dropped into an existing template using cheap papers and very generic materials. So I do think that the book as a unique object or the collaborative process that produces that is something that is really under threat now. We need to, it doesn't mean about producing a luxurious thing. It just means producing a considered thing, a thing where there's intelligences across lots of people are involved in producing it.
And how many people are these people that are committed in the production? How many for example, for the magazine, for the AA files, how many people are working on?
You don't need many people. Like an architect's office, you need an architectural office of 10 people to design an airport. You don't need a huge number. But with AA files, you need a very good graphic designer. You need a good range of editors, go from commissioning editors and editors who can really fix text to editors who spot tiny mistakes. So with 3 or 4 people, you can produce a lot. You can produce a lot of things.
Okay, cool, cool. Maybe there are some questions that arise here, the gallery or on Zoom.
We can speak also French, right?
Yes.
We also ask in French or German or American.
German, any German?
Okay.
Yes, there is one.
Je peux la poser en français?
Ouais.
Tu traduis?
Il y a Laurent par français.
Moi, j'ai plus une question sur le public des livres d'architecture. Pour qui sont faits les livres d'architecture? C'est un sujet pour quand on édite des livres ou des magazines sur l'architecture. Est-ce qu'on se pose la question du public et peut-être du grand public? Ou est-ce que ce n'est pas un sujet que déjà les architectes eux-mêmes sont déjà suffisamment... est-ce que c'est déjà suffisant comme public?
You heard, Laurent?
Yes, yes, and I translate briefly. I
Yes.
give my answers, and I will give it to Tom. It's a question: for whom do you publish, and who is your public, and especially for architectural books. This is a very good question, and this is a question I tried somehow to follow in a coherent way. I can give you some examples. As an academic, I'm teaching in architectural school, so I have to publish, and I do also, and like to do it in some so-called peer-reviewed journals. So these are journals which are just for my peers, and these are more historical and I think methodologically and perhaps also technically more developed subjects. Then I think there are also, we did also researches which seemed to belong to a broader public, like a research we did on thresholds, on the seuil. And this we explicitly decided to publish with a very, very well-distributed German journal of architecture, which is Arch Plus, which has, I think, 10,000 readers. So our goal was really to discuss the research we did in academia and to translate it into a format that was readable for a very, very large public. Now for the architectural books, this is extremely ambivalent, the question, I think. And for instance, the Olgiati book, I think it became a kind of art book. And somehow we had decided this because we decided to publish it not with academic press. We didn't decide to, or with somebody, but with Walter Koenig, which was at the time one of the big and also good editors of art books. And so there the public was really a public of artists. But and for instance, when we do a book on Swiss architects, like we did on Fritz Haller, who does this furniture, who you might know, USM Haller Furniture, this was then done with a Swiss publisher because for us it was clearly circumscribed to a Swiss public. So yes, I think the public you are speaking to is very important. Now, to whom do the architects speak? This is really another. This is really another issue, I think, and I can only say somehow that all the architects book I did were immediately sold out. So this is also a kind of really, really strange phenomena.
I just in terms of the audience, it's such a good question, and it's such a tricky question for me, to which I could give more than one answer, contradictory series of answers. I mean, the first answer in terms of who is your audience is I have no idea. And in a way, I like not knowing. I like the idea that the audience changes too, depends on what you're publishing. And it allows for a certain degree of surprise. For MIT, which is shocked me in terms of how committed it is to selling something, it always asks this question, who is your audience? And you have to give a very, very precise answer. And you say, my audience are North American architectural students. They are practicing architects in these territories. They are people who buy books by this person, and that person. And the total of these people is 1,823 people. So it's very, very precise. But my bigger fantasy is that the audience is out there, but it's much more amorphous. But what I would hope is that audience isn't restricted to the academy or the university or even to architecture. It can also step aside outside of the academy, and it talks about a wider public. I mean, Laurent, you're talking about the idea of a public, but actually the public itself is a very precarious thing now. You know, what is public in this terrible solipsistic, narcissistic world we have with ourselves? I'm here by myself in my apartment talking to my inanimate object that is my screen. I wish I was part of a public, a physical public. But the people I've always liked in terms of all forms of literature, all forms of writing, are people who move from a high world of the academy and the low world of the street. And this is precisely why I like the essay, that the best essayists, Walter Benjamin, Roland Barthes, Susan Sontag, are both highbrow and lowbrow. They can be communicate in the university and they can communicate in the newspaper. So that's my perfect audience, people who move in and out. But the problem is the world today is very compartmentalized, which I hate.
Yes, I agree. Some other questions?
Est-ce que je peux me permettre une autre question en français?
Oui.
Je suis un peu fatigué pour parler anglais. J'étais assez sensible à la remarque introductive de Tom Weaver sur le fait que éditer les livres, c'est aussi une manière de faire dialoguer deux mondes, le monde des intellectuels et des auteurs, et puis le monde des architectes praticiens. Et j'ai toujours trouvé qu'il y avait un vrai paradoxe sur le rapport des architectes à l'écriture, les architectes praticiens, je veux dire, qui ont souvent un point de vue extrêmement pointu et intéressant sur la réalité, parce qu'ils sont en permanence en train de la transformer. Et puis en même temps, ce point de vue, c'est super dur de le transformer en livre, parce que d'une part, ils n'ont pas le temps d'écrire, souvent, et d'autre part, ils ne sont pas formés à l'écriture. Ils écrivent souvent très mal. Et pour moi, c'est un des principaux paradoxes de l'édition architecturale, c'est comment faire des bons livres avec cette pensée qui est produite par les architectes praticiens qui ne savent pas écrire et n'ont pas le temps. Je voulais avoir votre avis là-dessus.
Can you help me there, Laurent?
No, yes. No. Laurent, would you like to translate, or shall I?
Yes, no. He just said he doesn't like you at all, and he lost 1 hour with you. No, he liked very much the remark you did somehow about the necessity to communicate with the different publics. But one of the key questions he had is about architects writing, and he said often they have no time or no skills to write, even if they are very much inside the building trade and perhaps have really strong and precise opinions and positions toward it. Is that the right translation, approximately?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the dilemma we all face. I mean, the one line, which is a line I've given before, is that architects can't write. You know, historically, none of them have been able to write. You know, it's just an innate, almost genetic problem to architects. They're incapable. But, I mean, and I use that line, and it's almost like a joke. But there's a certain truth in it too. But at the same time, architects are very good at communicating. I would argue that they're very good at talking and they're not so good at writing. But I would also argue that they're most interesting, paradoxically, architects, when they're talking or writing not about themselves, but about other things. So this is where I'm bored with the tyranny of the projects, the architect who talks about their own project endlessly. But I love the idea of, this is where the building comes in again. I think in newspapers or books or magazines or any form, I love the idea of putting one person in front of one building and you ask that person to write about that thing. And ideally, they haven't created that thing. And you'll get amazing things, amazing things. So in a sense, the purest form of architectural discourse would be the architectural review in the newspaper. And that would be the essence. That would be the thing I would like to do most, you know, edit the architectural page, but it doesn't happen now in a newspaper. Or there are certain platforms, but they're a dying breed. But I think architects writing off objects are brilliant. But I also think that architects talking about their lives are very, very good. I like architects telling stories about their childhood, about their education. Almost it becomes a kind of psychoanalyst, an analysis, an analytical relationship where you say, tell me about your mother. And then an architect telling you about their mother is very, very interesting. So, I mean, this is something that it's way before Freud. It's Vasarian, you know, an idea of the life, the architectural life, I think is a very, very interesting platform. So, and I'm trying to find those platforms of how to bring in architectural words instead of saying, hey, architects, you're not welcome because we know you cannot write.
But then is also what you said, this is where you intervene because you like to help them to communicate their ideas, not by being editor. So in this sense, your role is super precious because you understand what they're talking about. Because
maybe
you're an architect.
It does produce a narcissism as if only I can hear what they're saying. But in a way, you just have to understand where the interesting thing is. Is it when they're talking about their life? And are they good at talking and not writing? And therefore the voice recorder, the iPhone, becomes a very, very useful thing. Just put it in front of them and get a bottle of wine and get them to talk. So that's your task. That's your responsibility.
Right.
So you have to find how someone is communicating best and then let it flow.
Yeah.
But at the same time, with architects, as we know, they very quickly like being master and then having a servant. So they like some poor fucker to come in who then does all the actual writing for them. So you have to be careful that you don't start introducing a kind of master-servant relationship.
Yes. Yes.
Architectural books are obviously essential tools to convey architectural knowledge and culture among architects, of course, architectural students and others. Do you feel some kind of responsibility since you produce these books in like the, how can I say that, the faithfulness to architecture? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Do you feel kind of a duty to convey properly the work of who you're working for?
Yes, the answer is yes.
Perfect.
But I also like being part of that tradition. I mean, for you too, Laurent, I mean, right from the beginning in becoming an academic, or in a sense, a wider architect, you knew that you had a future ahead of you producing books, no?
I didn't know it, but I discovered that I liked very much doing it, and it became a way of doing architecture in some way, or doing a specific project. I think where there is a real risk and a real problem is also the power of money in producing architectural books. And I think that's where somehow you can nicely distinguish good editors from bad editors. Somehow the good editors not being sensitive to architects, just bring the money. Because this is a kind of strange evolution which happened, I would say, in the last 10 or 20 years, that every more or less successful architects buys somehow an editor to edit these books. And mostly, as Tom was saying, these are very poor books and are mostly also produced for the clients of the architects. And looking back, I think we should also see that the phenomena of architects' book is very recent. Otto Wagner got a book after his death, I think, only. Messel in Germany got a book at the end of his career. And a lot of others never got a book. I don't know if Behrens, for instance, got a book, or Berlage got a book while they were alive. I don't think so. And that's where I'm quite confident, and I am quite on the same vein like Tom in that I think somehow that the books of architects on their architecture might be a very good selling point at the moment, but is not a very relevant product.
But the same thing also applied not just to practitioners, but to historians too, Laurent. I mean, I was taught at Princeton by Alan Colquhoun, who spent 50 years teaching architecture. And throughout that period, he basically wrote one book, Essays on Architectural Criticism, which was a teeny little paperback with about 10 essays in it. Very end of his life, he produced another few books, but in a sense, his entire academic career had one book. And now in this crazy research culture or quantifiable culture of Google Scholar, an academic has to produce a book every year, which necessarily means you get a kind of hyenas and vultures who produce books very cheaply, very quickly, on the basis of that academic finding money to do so. So you lose the sort of the specialness of a book, I think, or that someone writes a book when they're ready to write a book, rather than that they have to write a book. Mm-hmm. This is the problem I face.
And perhaps this is also a key issue of that we didn't address, but when we were speaking about so-called public, I think what is also interesting with editors, and that's why somehow I'm so proud that they can publish with you, Tom, is somehow that they act also as gatekeepers. That you also want to publish inside a community that you cherish. And so I think where you publish and with whom you publish and for which public you publish is a really key in the way as an academic, but perhaps also as an architect, you publish.
More questions? I think here there's no more questions. Maybe online?
No, nobody.
Nobody?
No chat.
Okay.
Not even emojis.
Not even one.
Please. Yes. So anyway, I think it was a very nice way to see you, Tom. Long time not seen.
You too.
Next time we will do it in live somewhere, hopefully. So you could join us for a drink after and do what, Tom, you were mentioning before, like the small talks where stories can born. But thank you very much really for your availability tonight. It was very nice to talk to you. And see you next time.
Well, thanks for the invitation. And yeah, see you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.